Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Unit 10, Early 20th Century America. Our unit essential question is, how did the progressive movement, World War I, and the Roaring Twenties all impact South Carolina politically, socially, as well as economically? So this unit will be split into essentially three parts. We'll first discuss the progressive movement and how it impacted America and South Carolina, how World War I impacted the U.S. and South Carolina in Lesson 2. And then in Lesson 3, we'll discuss the Roaring Twenties, the boom time in America before the 1929 bust. So the progressive movement lasted from approximately 1890 to 1914. What does the word progressive mean? Well, when you have progress, you are essentially doing what? You are trying to move forward. Well, why did the progressive movement develop? Well, it developed in response to the growing problems in the growing cities. As the cities became more populated and the workplace became more populated, conditions for the average worker became worse. And the progressive people are going to try and change that. One of the problems that the progressives would latch onto was child labor, as we see here in this picture. The treatment of African Americans, the education of African Americans, the working conditions for everybody, but also the conditions for women, the right for women to have fair labor laws just like men, the conditions of the cities, the welfare of the cities, how do we handle sewage. During this time period, a lot of major cities like New York City or Chicago, Washington, D.C., all are going to have major influxes of people. People are moving there, so they have to change the sewage. They have to create new lines. They have to think about health care and how people are being treated. Women are going to fight for the right to vote during this time period. We call it suffrage. The suffrage movement was when women essentially were trying to fight for their equal rights. We also see the treatment of the poor and how do we help the poor not be poor anymore, as we see in this picture here. Or how do we improve working conditions and fair working conditions for all? One of the common things that we see during this time period are factories being burned, not on purpose but on accident because of the working conditions. And because the working conditions were so bad, people would die. The doors would be locked from the outside to where people would be working these long, laborious hours, and people died. People jumped from the windows, as we see here. So, what exactly is the progressive movement? Well, it is a movement created by the middle class who wanted to, A, reform the corrupt government to fix the dirty government, B, end the monopolies of big business. A monopoly is when a company owns or operates all of a sector. We think most commonly of Standard Oil. They controlled 98% of the oil out there during this time. The middle class wanted to end that. C, they wanted to improve conditions of the working class. D, they wanted to address problems of immigrants and migrants. But also they wanted to address the problems that women and children were having by improving working conditions for the women, giving them equal rights, but also giving out and making sure children had a better education. The progressive movement was not a political party. Now, if you were considered to be a progressive, there was not a party for you. You were just called a progressive. You could belong to the Republican Party, to the Democrat Party, to the Bull Moose Party that Theodore Roosevelt would start up. But you were considered a progressive. There was no political party, really. Now, one way that the people are going to get the word out is through mass media. The number one form of mass media was muckraking. And muckraking was getting information out to the people through newspapers and books. The way we think of email and Twitter and the internet is the way they thought of newspapers and books. It was able to get information out to the masses rather quickly and to report on the corruption, the filth of the large cities and industries. It made America aware of what was really going on. And by making Americans aware of what is going on, that is when we can see change happen. The progressive movement would actually begin within the urban areas of the cities and spread out to the state governments and then eventually out to the national level. The most progressive president that America ever saw was Theodore Roosevelt, good old Teddy. Teddy, one of his biggest accomplishments was setting up what we consider now the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, to where food and drugs and all those sorts of things are going to be inspected. Upton Sinclair is one of the most famous muckrakers, and he writes a book called The Jungle. And within that book, it tells of the deplorable conditions at the meatpacking factories in Chicago. Theodore Roosevelt reads this book, a muckraking book, and in turn helps create essentially the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration. Now, that's at the national level. What about South Carolina? Well, South Carolina was not interested in solving the problems of immigrants or African Americans because, one, the state doesn't have a lot of immigrants, and B, African Americans, once again, they're still not treated like equal citizens in the state. Now, Ben Tillman, love him or hate him, and we look back at him, and yes, he did help build and found Clemson College, but in reality, he wasn't a very nice guy when it came to the treatment of African Americans. He believed that he was a progressive because he was disenfranchising African Americans because he believed they were not good at making political decisions. Now, how ludicrous is that? How crazy is that? The progressive reforms for other groups of people did occur in South Carolina under the leadership of the Democratic Party. So the Democratic Party in South Carolina are going to see other reforms being done by them. Now, what you're going to end up doing on Thursday and Friday of this upcoming week is you're going to work in learning stations. Now, in these learning stations, you are going to look at child labor, education, healthcare, the temperance movement, women's suffrage, and corrupt governments. You're going to research why it needed to be reformed and what reforms or fixes were found. Then on the later part of the week, scratch that, not Thursday and Friday, but Monday and Tuesday. No, Thursday and Friday. Sorry, Thursday and Friday. On Friday, we'll end up revealing the answers and discussing your findings. Robert Cooper, Governor Robert Cooper, is one of South Carolina's most progressive governors. He would actually raise taxes and help education because that raised income tax, or those raised taxes, are going to go directly toward public education. He also increased the number of months children went to school up to 7 months. If I'm not mistaken, before that it was about 5 months of schooling. Good Governor Richard Manning was the most progressive governor in South Carolina. He would fight for a fair system of taxes. He would establish more public schools. He would improve the hospitals. He would also pave the roads and highways and also help create the South Carolina Highway Department because he realized that if South Carolina is going to be influential in what's happening around the world, then they need to have good transportation. And the only way to have good transportation is to pave those roads and highways because by now we have the automobile. It's just not railroads anymore, but the automobile is going to be another great form of transportation. Now, what I want you guys to do is go back through, re-listen to the audio lecture, and also read your lesson 1 notes. And as you're reading your lesson 1 notes, think about in your head how America is going to fix child labor, education, health, temperance, women's suffrage, and the corrupt governments. How are we going to reform those major problems? Thank you, and we will see you sometime this week.